Dune Part 2 is a magnificent cinematic experience, and a lot of it comes down to how well Denis Villeneuve was able to transport the characters from book to screen. But with it, he made some significant changes to the ending. One of them is a perfect example of how an adaptation can improve upon the original, but another how it can be a problem in the narrative in the potential sequels later on. So let's look at how and why Denis Villeneuve changed the ending of Dune. To start, we have to look back to when Dune by Frank Herbert was first published. At the time, everyone became entranced by Paul Muad'Dib's charismatic character, and by doing so, they overlooked important clues that the author had left in the text. As Dr. Liet Kynes lay dying in the desert, he remembered the words, "No more terrible disaster could befall your people than for them to fall into the hand of a hero." Herbert kept foreshadowing Paul's descent into tyranny and the transformation of an utopian civilization of Fremen into a violent dystopia. And very few readers realized that Paul's story was not only a Greek tragedy on an individual level, but served also as much larger warning against narcissism and pride of a messianic figure that could lead entire societies into ruin. And so Frank Herbert decided to write Dune Messiah to further explore Paul's transformation. Now, when it comes to the adaptation, it is very obvious that Denis Villeneuve knew that story. And I would venture a statement that it was probably one of the main reasons why he decided to split Dune into Part 1 and Part 2. Apart from the obvious, like making time to properly introduce the character, set up the political conflicts, and create the tone with excellent world building, I think he wanted to make sure that the audience would go on this journey with him, falling in love with Paul as a charismatic hero, watching him struggle with accepting his responsibility, to later sharing the feeling of dread as he falls into the darkness. And he does it in a spectacular fashion. But I think maybe Paul's whole journey and characterization deserves a separate video, because Paul's depiction is not the change. It's just an artistic choice that drives the author's point home. The change happens with two characters, Chani, Paul's love interest, and Aliyah, Paul's sister. Chani as a character in the book is practically non-existent. In this similar fashion to Peter Jackson with Arwen, Villeneuve decided to make Chani a fully fleshed out character, giving her much more to do in the adaptation. In the book, Paul and Chani's relationship spans years as the Fremen's liberation war continues. They have a child that is eventually killed by the Harkonnens, and that only further fuels Paul's need for revenge and kickstarts the path for holy war. In that time, also Paul's sister is born, so when we get to the final showdown with the Emperor, she is already a child, a so-called abomination, born with a mind fully formed, an adult in a child's body, already with an ability of using the voice. Because the adaptation takes place in the span of a few months, we don't get to see Aliyah in that way. But also we get a completely different Chani. This Chani is a very capable Fremen warrior, but also a skeptic, someone who constantly challenges the prophecies of Lisan al-Gaib. And I think it is a very conscious and intentional change. Knowing what we know now about how original Dune was received and how everyone had a hard time with Paul's transformation from the mythical hero to a dark anti-hero, Villeneuve wanted to make sure that the audience would have a character going on that journey with them. As we followed Paul's point of view in Dune Part 1 and then in Part 2, I remember having thoughts, why are they dragging this romance out for so long? When we got to the moment when Paul finally drinks the water of life, I thought, oh, that's why. Because suddenly the point of view shifts from Paul to Chani. We are no longer watching the events unfold through Paul's eyes, but through hers. We experience his change through the character that was in love with him and who used to tell him, "You will never lose me as long as you stay who you are." As Paul gets high on his own power, Chani becomes more distrustful and afraid of him, just like the audience is supposed to. And Paul becomes a hollow, menacing shell. The transition is jarring. There is no more internal struggle. When he makes a play for power and decides to marry the Emperor's daughter, we feel the heartbreak and disappointment that Chani feels. And that doesn't happen in the book. In the book, Chani dutifully accepts the role of Paul's official concubine, and while the book frames it in a romantic way, with what Lady Jessica says to Chani, that princess will have the name, yet she'll live as less than a concubine, never to know a moment of tenderness from the man to whom she's bound. While we, Chani, we who carry the name of concubine, history will call us wives. It works for the book, but it would never work for this film, because this Chani never wanted Paul to become the emperor or the messiah. She loved him for the man he was, not for the figure he became. Book Chani has no such dilemmas because she, like the rest of the Fremen and subsequently the audience, blindly follows Paul and believes him to be the Messiah. In the movie, I feel like this spirit of the original reader's reaction to Dune is captured by the character of Stilgar, who sees the signs of Paul's heroism everywhere. It just goes to show that the saying among filmmakers you can never portray cult-like figures accurately in fiction once again proves to be right. Because if you do a good enough job with it, the audience will always fall under the spell of that persona. When you make a charismatic cult leader your main character and follow his POV, we fall in love with them instantly and we become blind to their dark side. That's why I think changes made with Chani's character are so deliberate. Villeneuve wanted to make sure everyone understood that Paul at the end is not the character to be admired or blindly followed. The change with Aliyah, however, signals that Villeneuve will definitely be done with Dune's universe after Dune Messiah. And in doing so, he just made sure it will be a nightmare for anyone who will be hired by Warner Bros. To adapt Children of Dune after him. Without going into spoilers for the rest of the series, in the book it is Aliyah who kills Baron Harkonnen. And that is significant for her story, as well for the conflicts that happen later on in the books. Not to mention that her first appearance in the book is bone-chilling and cool as she faces the Emperor and Bene Gesserit. We kinda knew that Villeneuve was only interested in Paul's story in the Dune universe, but hell, how are they gonna get out of this pickle later on? Because with the success of this trilogy, there is no way that the producers will not try to adapt all of the books. Is Villeneuve trying to make that impossible on purpose? Dune Part 2 is much darker, much more character development heavy and technical with action scenes. And once again, I feel like I'm in the minority here when I say that I think my favorite so far is Dune Part 1. It was much more immersive and groundbreaking with visuals and with its sound, and just felt like magic came to life on screen. Don't get me wrong, I love Dune Part 2, but it's like deciding between Fellowship of the Ring and Two Towers, or Batman Begins versus The Dark Knight. It's a good dilemma to have when your series is chock full with amazing movies. The ending with lack of Aliyah is on a technical and narrative level potentially problematic, but I personally love that the movie ended with Chani. We start Dune's story with Paul's decision that his life, his path, leads into the desert, only for us to realize that that road led to destruction. Chani, on the other hand, represents purity and utopia of the Fremen world. Some people see her last act as an act of a woman scorned, but I see it as an extension of who she is as a character in that movie. She feels the disappointment and heartbreak, of course, but ultimately her life is not beside the Emperor, who betrayed who he was for that power. Her life is in the desert. If she were to take the path books laid out for her, it would feel dishonest to this character. She promised to stay with him for as long as he stayed who he was. And Paul didn't. So there's nothing left for her here. That is until we get to Dune Messiah, but we will have to wait and see how Villeneuve continues their story.